All right, Crim 20, let's get into Chapter 10. I can't say that Chapter 10 is the most exciting topic that we have discussed in this class, but it's important because obviously we need to understand how prisons are managed. You think about a lot of this, just say, for example, let's use, I'm not talking about a prison, but let's talk about, for example, Margaret Mims. She is the sheriff of Fresno County. So she is also in charge of the Fresno County Jail, which is a multi-million-dollar facility. So think about what the requirements were for her to get that job. She'd been in law enforcement for decades and probably had gone into management. I'm sure she was in management in a law enforcement agency. So how does that prepare her? And I'm just using her as an example. I'm sure she's a great lady, but how does that prepare her to run a multi-million-dollar facility? Think about being a crim major. Do you think after you finish all your criminology classes, you're going to be able to run a multi-million-dollar facility? So that's kind of one of the weaknesses in a lot of the jails, prisons, correctional facilities in general, is that the people who are running them aren't necessarily business people. So we'll start with that, but let's move on to State Department of Corrections Director. So the Chief Executive Officer of a state or federal Department of Corrections is who this person is. The white part on the bottom down here, this is the definition. So many times we're going to call that person a warden. They're in charge of all aspects of the prison. So whether something good or bad happens, it's all going to fall on the warden. There's an inspector, and I have a friend who happens to be an inspector for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And a lot of times these are people that are like internal affairs investigators. So they do have internal affairs investigators that work for the Department of Corrections, and he's quite busy, as I understand. So but this is kind of like an internal affairs type of division where they are investigating people who work within the facility. There are, of course, administrative functions. You have to have human relations, personnel, community services, field operation functions. That's going to be basically, we're talking about parole there, and general administration. Someone has to do payroll. Someone has to make decisions on behalf of the department. You have prison staff. They're typically, the officers that are assigned into prison are typically considered the custody faculty, or not faculty, custody staff. So they are responsible for the security of the facility. You also have treatment staff. So while you're in a correctional facility, if we had been lucky enough to get to go to the jail this year, which we were unable to do, but you would see that there are lots of nurses, there's mental health staff, there are substance abuse treatment counselors, there are teachers, there are things like that. So this is a different type of person who works in the facility. They're not necessarily in charge of the actual security of the facility, but they are certainly another important aspect of that facility. And then you have your services. You have to have food, obviously. So you might have HR people. You might have a computer guy. I'm sure that every correctional facility has the computer guy or girl who handles any kind of technological issues. You would have commissary functions, laundry, food, health services, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different services that take place every day inside of a prison. We kind of talked about the pods and the way they were, not in this chapter, but a long time ago when we actually used to be able to see each other in person in class. But typically the prisons are broken down by units or pods. So each pod is supervised by a person. Typically your sergeant or whatever you want to call it, but the pods are broken down into smaller groups, and there are supervisors in each of those units. There's a unit manager, case manager, correctional counselor, I'm just going to let you read that. So you can press pause if you need to read. How to control inmate behavior. This is a tough one. There are policies and procedures. They are audited. The American Correctional Association is an association. We're going to talk more about that on the next slide. So I'm going to skip on to this. So there are a lot of different ways to control inmate behavior, and a lot of us would say treating the inmates with respect a lot of times is going to earn you their respect and thus their behavior. So that is certainly one way to do it. But classifying inmates and making sure they're put in the right place to be as successful as they can be is really important and will help control behavior. The disciplinary system has to be clear as to what the expectations are, and it has to be clear as to what the consequences will be. So if you don't have consistent discipline, the inmates will not know what the expectations are. So consistent, fair, evenly handed out discipline is really important. When you walk into most jails, prisons, they're going to have the rules will be posted on the wall for all the inmates to see. Typically they know the rules, but they're actually up there on the wall as well. And then they have an administrative appeals process, which I usually would call a grievance. So if the inmate doesn't think he was treated fairly, they have a right to grieve that, to file some paperwork and have a higher up, like an appeal kind of, look at the discipline to see if it was appropriate. So where do correctional facilities recruit? They recruit at schools, they recruit at job fairs, high schools, colleges. I have seen the billboards on Freeway 99 before from, I want to say it was the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department was hiring correctional officers. CDCR, they posted on social media. You can go to, of course, job websites. So how do they recruit? They recruit pretty heavily in a lot of different areas. A lot of times they're going to be looking at educational institutions. How do they retain them? Is that the next question? Okay. So what takes place during the hiring process? Okay, this is that really long process. It's about the same for law enforcement as it is for corrections. You're typically going to start with a written exam. If you pass that, then it's very common that they might have you come in for an oral board where they would have probably 8 or 10 people sitting at a table asking you questions. If you do well on that, sometimes they're going to have you do things like a medical exam. They want to make sure that you don't have a broken back or some other health issue that would make you inappropriate for the job. They're going to do a background. They're definitely going to do a background. Very in-depth background. You're probably going to do a polygraph exam. That's when they hook you up to the lie detector machine, which is no fun, but basically is pretty much a requirement. You're going to have to do a psychological evaluation so they can make sure that you can psychologically handle the job. You probably will go through one more oral board where you'll have a smaller group of people come in and interview you. Pretty intimidating interviews. They're no joke. Trying to think, am I forgetting anything? You got your psych, you got your medical, you got your background, poly, written, oral. I think that's it. But you're all probably familiar with this. How do they keep staff? This is tough. They keep staff by paying them well. Really, I mean, that's ultimately how they most prisons are able to keep their employees. It's tough to do this job for your entire career. It's not an easy job, obviously. So retention, offering them promotional opportunities, and paying them well. That's typically how you would be able to retain employees. And collective bargaining. This is your union or your association. Now, I have kind of mixed feelings about unions, although every job I've ever had where there was an option to be in a union, I have joined because Ultimately, for me, it's an insurance policy. You pay a certain amount of money, and if something crazy happens at work, you have legal representation. So collective bargaining, ultimately, that's going to be your union. You're going to pay dues every month, a certain amount every month, and they are going to basically fight for you, which is a good thing in many instances. However, when you think about it, there are probably some employees that maybe should be fired, but they're not, because the union will fight for just as hard for them as they will for you. I think that's it. That was a quick one.